I'm finding myself increasingly wary with the kind of standing in for, or a kind of origin story that's becoming cemented around AIDS activism, and it's very New York centric, and it's very, 25 years ago was the moment when it all came together, and it's very rooted in homophobia and ideas about, kind of the culture wars, basically. That's where the U.S. culture wars in the 80s and 90s. That's where AIDS activism grew out of, and I would be interested in opening that up more, internationally, and just what would it look like if we started in Cuba or Haiti with the, as a generative narrative about how this came about, right? How this movement came about. In more recent AIDS activism, I think in a film that I made about access to treatment activism in the 2000s, from about 2000 to 2005, called Pills, Profits, Protest. We started that in South Africa because that's, I think, arguably where a certain kind of direct action AIDS activism started now, and arguably government leadership on AIDS and kind of really engaging the government directly and making them do things is a story about Brazil. So I think there's different ways to kind of to shift around the narrative, and I hope that that all the creativity, I mean, this is a community that I really love, right? The New York queer AIDS, what do you call it? Yeah, those of us who are left, and and all the kind of history and re-emerging creativity that I'm sensing, and I just hope that doesn't get kind of closed down into a fixed kind of story about where AIDS activism began.
Activism, these moments of the individuals standing between legal regimes and their techniques of oppression through activism or through happenstance or whatever else. This film brings a lot of them together, and in a sense I wonder, what does Oscar Wilde really have to do with AIDS activism? They're such different contexts. I'm just talking about the Felix Gonzalez Torres billboard. And at the same time, the kind of montage technique, I think, is a really productive way of thinking about differences and leaving these differences intact instead of sort of the coercive force of narrative, which presents kind of one argument. Here we're allowed to think of a lot of different things at the same time, which I really appreciated.
What this brings up for me in our kind of like neoliberal era is not only the violence of representation, but also what happens with the dangers of monumentalizing something, freezing movements or moments in the past, whether it's a Stonewall Rebellion or Compton's Cafe Uprising. And we all know that AIDS is not past, that AIDS is not over, that people living with HIV and AIDS are still under attack, and it's still critical to act up and fight back. We're still living in the age of AIDS and in a time of mass incarceration, mass deportation, anti-queer and anti-trans violence, overkill, HIV criminalization and sex work criminalization, and the racialized, militarized, and anti-poor war on drugs. So some of the questions that this film prompted for me are, in the face of this, how might and how are we continuing the legacy of freedom fighters, artists and activists like Kiyoshi Kuramiya, Tracy Bumpus, Sylvia Rivera, Marlon Riggs, Essex Hemphill, Chloe DeZublio, Marsha P. Johnson, and Audre Lorde? How can we create more HIV/AIDS awareness and resources in less oppressive and stigmatizing ways? How can we move beyond media sensationalized categories and stereotypes like the DL, down low, trans invisibilizing, sex negative, and gay shaming CDC categories like MSM? How can we continue to occupy a politics of HIV prevention justice that treats AIDS as an intersectional and cross-cutting issue that's crucial for our collective liberation? Thank you.